Welcome to Module 6, American Government in Introduction to Political Science, Polls 2101 at the University of West Georgia. We're now at the midpoint of our class, and with our midterm complete, it's time to move into the second half of the class. In this part of the class, we're going to delve a lot more into the actual political science subfields, and we start with American government. Now, American government is a big field. It encompasses a number of different subfields, like political behavior, political institutions, and law and judicature, with their focus particularly on American politics. There are obviously international and comparative elements of voting behavior, political institutions, law, and so on. We'll cover those in the comparative politics component of the class that comes later. But for now, we're focusing on American politics and its study. The readings for this section will give you a brief overview of some of the great works in American political science and introduce you to the state of research in those fields. But we need to start at the very beginning and with the foundational documents of American political thought. The Federalist and Anti-Federalist Papers. Each of these sets of documents was created during the run-up to constitutional ratification, each by the side supporting or opposing it. The Constitution represented a massive shift from the existing and failing Articles of Confederation, so the public needed to know all about it and had many questions. The Federalist writers, notably James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton, sought to allay people's fears that a much more powerful federal government would become tyrannical or overtaken by special interests who put their goals ahead of those of the general population. As you're reading the Federalist Papers, pay particular attention to Federalist Papers number 10 and number 51. They're widely regarded by political scientists as two of the most significant writings in all of the Federalist Papers. The Anti-Federalists were in a similar but inverse situation. Shays' rebellion had exposed the failures of the Articles of Confederation. So even the staunchest supporters of state sovereignty knew that the Articles were not sustainable as a governing document. Some sort of change needed to be made. Still, the Anti-Federalists, such as George Clinton and Richard Henry Lee, took to their pamphlets to warn the new American citizenry about the potential tyrannical powers of a stronger national government. You'll see this in Anti-Federalist number 51. Diminished state sovereignty. You'll see this in Anti-Federalist number 17. And outside influence, which you'll see in Anti-Federalist number 3. Power is another consistent theme in political science. And so once we finished with the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers, we're going to push forward into the 20th century with Bachrach and Baratz. They explore theories of American political power in their article, Two Faces of Power. What the article is at its core is a critique of two different views that emerged on political power in the United States. One advocated by Robert Dahl in his book Who Governs, and the other in Charles Beard's more controversial The Power Elite. Bachrach and Baratz look at power as mobilized bias, which differentiates them from the Dahl model of power as a balanced equilibrium of competing interests, and Beard's more conspiratorial view of power as purely motivated by fiscal dominance of one group over another. We shift then into looking at Congress in depth, and Fenno and Mayhew. Fenno and his work Homestyle followed members of the House of Representatives around their districts during campaigns, trying to discover strategies and tactics that these elected officials use when they interact with their constituents. And Mayhew leaves another lasting impression on the discipline. His complementary work saw members of Congress as single-minded seekers of re-election, and accordingly, all of their strategies were in service of seeking re-election. Mayhew goes into more depth, and this will be the readings focus for our module. So pay particular attention to Mayhew and his readings. We then move to elections, where Key and Erickson and Wright are the two readings you'll have in that segment. Erickson and Wright examine the connection between voting and issue preferences, while Key presents an idea that some elections leave more of a lasting impact than others. These critical elections show patterns of voting behavior and partisanship and how they change over time. The presidency deserves attention. We include Richard Neustadt in his classic note that the most powerful tool the chief executive has is the power to persuade. We move on to the judiciary and legal studies, especially because the judicial branch has been able to create its own extra constitutional power base in judicial review. Former Chief Justice Warren Burger reflects on judicial review and the legal reasoning behind it in the readings. Finally, Acharya and colleagues address an issue that is significant to this day: the legacy of America's centuries of slavery. The authors show that racial attitudes to this day are still largely connected to patterns that existed during the era of slavery, even with more than 150 years of the 13th Amendment in place. There are still vestiges of attitudes and orientations that harken back to slavery and perhaps keep us from achieving the goals of racial equity that we have in modern day America. The readings will combine to give you a good overview of some of the most important works in the study of American government and the contributions political science has made to our knowledge of them.